You don't do a PS5 Pro because I think it's a dumb idea. That's it. That's the entire video. All right, bye guys. All right, to actually explain why I think the PS5 Pro is a dumb idea, we need to kind of explain some historical context as to why the first Pro consoles even existed in the first place, because I feel like a lot of people who are parroting and building up hype for PS5 Pro are people who are like young enough that like the PS4, Xbox One was their first and only generation of gaming. So this whole process seems kind of normal to them. Now, the idea of upgrading a console's capability without entirely switching out the base platform is nothing new. I mean, we had like Game Boy Color in the 90s. Even NEC had tried to do like an upgraded version of the TurboGrafx 16 called the Super Graphics in the 90s, which you could argue was the first Pro console ever. But really, the idea of like upgraded iterations of base home consoles really became a mainstream idea in 2016 and 2017. Both Sony and Microsoft decided to release their own upgraded versions of consoles, the PlayStation 4 Pro and the Xbox One X. Now, why exactly did Sony and Microsoft decide to do this? I mean, they had never done it before. Nobody had decided to release upgraded versions of the PS3 and the 360 during a life cycle that was similarly as long. So what caused them to do this all of a sudden? See, the original PlayStation 4 and Xbox One were designed to fully saturate an HD television. Something that the PlayStation 3 and the Xbox 360 can never really fulfill. But right when those consoles came out to be able to fully saturate those HD displays that we had had for many, many years at that point, we started getting 4K coming into the market. Now, this is only really notable because I think 4K TVs were actually getting adopted way faster than I think anybody was expecting at the time. Sony and Microsoft, I guess, independently decided, hey, let's try to cater to this brand new wave of consumers. Somebody that wants something that can fully utilize that 4K TV. Now, in a vacuum, this strategy sounds actually kind of okay, but that's not really taking into account like the console gaming model where you oftentimes you're not making money on the machine, you're making money on the games. I really don't understand the point of this exactly. Sony and Microsoft had to spend millions of dollars designing these machines. They probably weren't making any money on these machines for a lot of their life, if at all, and developers had to spend a bunch of time and resources making patches for these games, and since they were free patches, that was the route we were going to go down. They weren't making any money from like making their games better for these new machines. So I don't know exactly what either company achieved here. My little conspiracy theory here is I think Microsoft wanted to do the One X first to fix some of the inherent problems of the base Xbox One, and then PlayStation like had to respond. Because if they didn't have a console in kind of a similar market, people would start buying Xboxes over PlayStations, and they couldn't let that happen. So really, these devices had two objectives. The first and clearest objective was being a 4K gaming, like, premium machine. And the second one was a little bit more subtle, but like fixing some of the problems with the base consoles. I think for that first point, both consoles actually succeeded pretty well. Even the PS4 Pro, which being much weaker, you wouldn't have expected maybe to do as well, but checkerboard rendering was actually surprisingly pretty good for UHD. There's tons of games from that period that ran consistently above like 1080p, like enough that you could notice the difference. But as devices that fix the flaws of their base machines, I have to give them both a big fat F. And that's not entirely those consoles' fault, because really the big flaw with both machines is something that you couldn't fix, which was the CPU. The CPU was laughably bad, but in order for you to not break game compatibility like halfway through the generation on an upgrade, you couldn't just change the CPU architecture all of a sudden. So you just got CPUs that ran faster, but didn't fix any of the problems. Again, I will say that the One X, I think, succeeded in this area much better than the PS4 Pro, although it's not really a compliment to say that, because the base Xbox One had like so many more fundamental problems than the base PS4 that like you're just giving them the most improved player award at that point. Now fast forward to 2023 and oh wow, all of a sudden we're hearing rumors of a PlayStation 5 Pro existing. But My real question here is what conditions in the market are really like forcing this thing to exist? I mean, you could say, well, HDMI 2.1 TVs are becoming more widespread and common VRR, but the base PS5 and Series X come with HDMI 2.1 ports on them. So it's not a matter of, hey, we want to take advantage of this new technology, but our previous machines literally couldn't. They can. And I know we could get into arguments about, well, the GPU can't fully take advantage of the 4K 120 hertz HDR on these things, blah, 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 blah. But the original machines could, from like a literal output standpoint. If you designed a game for it that way, you could. And if you want to talk about like that second function that those original Pro consoles filled, the PS5 Pro actually has like a weirdly big problem in that the base PS5 is actually like a really well done, competent console. I definitely have my gripes and nitpicks and like things I hate about it, but from like a pure like chip design perspective, how much bandwidth, how much memory, the CPU cores, the GPU, I have no real issue with it. Now, everything around PS5 Pro is entirely rumors here, but the impression that I get from reading like discussion about the PS5 Pro, the only reason this console even exists is that certain like executives at PlayStation are just like not happy with how the console's performing in ray tracing. That they might be the heads of a bunch of different PlayStation studios and they're pushing rendering and they're messing with ray tracing and they're like, man, I really want to implement this specific ray tracing feature, but the original PS5 just can't do it. They are pushing Sony to be like, hey, we want to fulfill our creative vision better by getting a more powerful console. So could you make a more powerful console for us? So maybe think of it less as a PS5 Pro, but more of a PS5 do-over. But for as stupid as I think that is, I think there is a way you could design a Pro that isn't like entirely stupid and like self-servicing to like Sony executives. Now, firstly, I'm not expecting this console to come out until like summer of 2024 at like the absolute earliest. It still seems way too early in the generation, even though like 3 years in, we got the PS4 Pro just because, you know, I'm expecting the chip to be an APU again like last time. I'm not expecting we're going to suddenly get chiplets. That design is so like tight and integrated and those, you know, latencies are so optimized down. And I imagine they don't want to really rock the boat there. I could see going from like 350 millimeter squared, so bigger than even the launch day PS5, to like maybe 375 millimeters squared. It's like bigger enough than the base console that you might have room for more compute and stuff like that, but it's not like massive GPU size that you're gonna have your problem with your yields or anything. Now, as for the GPU, this is gonna be a little bit complicated. I'm expecting the actual rasterization part of the GPU to be RDNA 3. I'm actually expecting the ray tracing cores to maybe not even be RDNA 3s, maybe they'll be RDNA 4s, like maybe Sony has asked AMD, like, hey, could you give it that RT good stuff early, just because they seem so desperate for better ray tracing. Now, as for the number of compute units, I feel like this is a little bit tricky here. I know Mark Cerny really loves talking about like, oh yeah, the PS5, we wanted to go with faster clock GPU cores instead of, well, like wider ones, because that makes it easier for developers, blah, 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 blah. I hope to God no game programmers are tying game logic to a dynamic GPU clock speed, but I think just for safety's sake, I think we probably want to do more cores running at the same clock speed rather than like have maybe a similar number of compute units, but just really push up the clocks on a new architecture. Now, one benefit of a Pro console that actually affects gamers, not just developers on the back end, is that you'll get more performant games. And so with so many PlayStation 5 games having like uncapped frame rate modes and stuff like that, I actually think this would be like really, really cool, especially this generation. In fact, I could see like a bizarre situation where the PS5 Pro might actually ruin some games like VRR modes, that instead of it being like this interesting kind of like 40 FPS VRR mode that is like a step up over the 30 FPS version, like it gets close to 60 from the performance boost, but like it can't quite get over that line. It's hanging out like maybe the high 50s or something, that it just turns the VRR mode into a worse 60 FPS mode. Now here's a question. Existing PlayStation 5 games with ray tracing, how much would the RT cores being better by themselves, separate from the raster performance, actually increase your frame rate? Now, the answer to this, I'm not exactly sure. I've seen like a ton of benchmarks that seem to kind of give me conflicting information on how exactly like ray tracing works. Now, initially watching all these benchmarks, I was under the impression ray tracing cores necessarily weren't like speeding things up in the way that rasterization performance increasing traditionally does. That turning on any form of ray tracing, you still take a performance hit in general. But it was just that as you increase the ray tracing settings, that you weren't dropping off as hard. So now counter to that, I have asked and posted to Reddit asking people about this. And I swear the AMD subreddit says that RDNA 2 versus RDNA 3 drops off nowhere near as badly with the same ray tracing effects as RDNA 2. So I don't know exactly who to believe here. Now, as for performance, I think PS5 Pro being double the performance just seems natural, right? PS4 Pro was that kind of performance jumps. It seems natural. But I'm not expecting like the actual GPU compute power itself to be twice as powerful. There's really been like a lot of interesting tricks and things added to AMD's toolset like since the base PS5 has come out. And so I really think that there is a lot of room here to like implement sort of new interesting things while keeping like the cost of the die itself down. Well, one really interesting thing that got added to AMD's portfolio after the development and launch of the original PlayStation 5 was the acquisition of Xilinx. For those of you who don't know, Xilinx is like an FPGA slash ASIC technology company that AMD acquired. You may have seen AMD promoting XDNA products. These are like FPGA kind of specialized hardware adjacent stuff under the AMD brand name. Now, I think the most obvious thing that if you're Sony, that you go back to AMD to ask them to make another console for you, is to look at Xilinx and ask them, hey, can you make like in a hardware accelerated like AI upscaling thing for us, please? Now, this isn't the craziest idea in the world or anything, but it does provide a couple of benefits over the solution that Sony has been using currently for game developers. Firstly, a dedicated hardware upscaler would theoretically allow for a much cleaner final image result than FSR2 currently does. And secondly, if you can put it on a dedicated hardware accelerator, that means you're freeing up GPU resources that would be used for FSR for rendering something else. Maybe you could render more frames or something like that. Maybe you could do more graphics effects or something like that. Now, to save myself from saying FSR hardware accelerator for like 20 more times in the rest of this video, I'm just going to shorten it down to FSRX because it's a custom solution, so it doesn't follow any of the numbering that AMD has already established. The X for Xilinx, and then you also have RX in the name, like what Radeon names a lot of their GPUs, like, you know, RX, blah, blah, blah. Now, dedicated hardware would probably fix one of the biggest, like, problems, if you want to call it that, of, like, AAA games on the new consoles, which is the, let's just say, liberal use of FSR2. I swear there's a Digital Foundry video every month from some big AAA game specifically designed for these new consoles that they find like, yeah, the base resolution's like sub 1080p and it just is really, really upscaled using FSR2 to 4K or whatever. And like, we just don't care anymore at this point. We're just all kind of jaded.
For the PS5 version of the game, my colleague Tom Morgan counted results roughly in the ranges on screen for the two modes on offer.
At 1280 by 720 on each. Every shot tested so far comes in at 720p, on camera cuts in cinematics, or at the screen's edges in gameplay.
Now, in my opinion, from my limited use of FSR2, I understand the criticisms of the technology from other people, and I understand why people are complaining about it, but at least to me, I feel like when FSR2 is implemented properly, it actually is like pretty good. Not as great as like NVIDIA's DLSS, but it is pretty good. But when it's not implemented correctly, things can get really bad. In fact, the use of specific dedicated hardware make a lot of those rumors about the PS5 Pro being marketed as an 8K console, I don't think actually that ridiculous. That if you just input a base resolution image of like 1440p or 4K, and the AI upscaler just handles it and makes it look really, really nice in 8K, I don't think that Sony is really like deceiving you, like if it's well done and the hardware works. And with the introduction of dedicated hardware also opens the Pandora's box of frame generation.
All right, quick interjection here. So while I was editing this video, AMD unveiled FSR3, and it turns out it can work on the PS5. I am screaming internally right now. But so what I'm talking about frame generation for PS5 Pro in this next little bit of the video, what I'm talking about is hardware accelerated ones versus using the GPU itself to do it.
I will say that one positive of frame generation in a Pro console is it would really get around the CPU bottlenecks that the PS4 Pro could never, because frame generation is just generating images in between frames and it doesn't add any load to the CPU. So if you're really CPU limited, you could really only practically run it to 30. You can just frame generate up to 60, and hey, you have a 60 FPS experience. Which, speaking of the CPU, brings me to the CPU. I'm really not expecting too much to rock the boat here. I'm expecting Zen 2 again. So if we were to assume that we can't really tinker with the architecture or anything like that, which, okay, that's fair. And I really don't expect these cores to really clock faster or anything. How exactly do you increase CPU performance? Well, I actually think you're probably going to get way better CPU performance. Instead of trying to like clock the cores to 5 gigahertz on like 4 nanometer, I think it's actually smarter to just add 2 more cores to the 8 cores. I feel like 2 more cores would give a little bit more wiggle room in terms of like, you know, if you're going to go for a pro experience, you need, you know, more CPU power. You can multi-thread it out a little bit more. Adding 2 more cores would add like 25% multi-threading performance, which I think would match about the clock speed bump on the PS4 Pro's cores. All right, so for everything not CPU, GPU, FSR, X related, who exactly is going to fab this chip in TSMC? As for what node exactly, I think 4 nanometer actually might work. 3 nanometer seems really exclusively owned by Apple at this point for their iPhones, and I don't really see that changing by the time this console would come out at like some point in 2024. 5 nanometer seems to make sense, but 4 just seems like it has that little extra juice to it that you get a little bit extra performance out of it. You can maybe make the die a little bit smaller. All right, so for the SSD here, I really spent a lot of time thinking about the SSD, just because like every Pro console seems to come with an upgrade to the storage over their base model. But the more I thought about it, the more I'm like, you know, I feel like you actually have to have a faster SSD. If this sort of dream that PlayStation and third-party developers keep talking about how the SSD is gonna change game rendering forever, like it's not just gonna be no load times, it's just gonna fundamentally change the way that like games are developed and how game rendering is done. That having bigger assets for a Pro console, you have to have a consequently faster SSD to go with it, right? But the problem is any sort of speed increase you can't really do without making it like super duper overkill. Like yes, the PS5 SSD is like soldered to the board and you could do some custom weird PCIe lane thing or whatever, like 4x6 or 4x8. But if Sony still wants the option for a user to put in an SSD, they're gonna have to like follow consumer standards. And the consumer standards is really like only buy 4 drives. So really, the only way that you can get a speed increase while also allowing people to be able to plug NVMEs into the system is by having to go with PCIe Gen 5 by 4. And I think Gen 5 by 4 is like pretty omega overkill, to be honest. Now, I would hope that Sony doesn't use garbage tier like QLC NAND in the PS5 Pro, but again, it's like an optics thing because nerd stuff like QLC NAND versus TLC NAND, I don't think Sony particularly cares about. Like, oh, wow, you know, the cells in your NAND flash are not going to wear out as easily, extending the life of the drive. Who cares, right? Who cares about that kind of stuff? And with a faster SSD would be what I presume to be a faster version of Kraken decompression on the PS5 SoC itself. I mean, probably twice as fast considering you know, the SSD's twice as fast. RAM. RAM. I guess 20 gigabytes seems fine to me. At like whatever is like the current like kind of speed standard for GDDR6 at this point. I chose 20 over 24 because 24 Like, that's a lot compared to 16. That's like a plus 50%. I mean, I know ideally you would have more ray tracing effects going on, and ray tracing does increase VRAM usage, but I don't know. I feel like 20 gigabytes would account for that and give like a little bit more wiggle room to developers who are asking for like an extra gig or maybe even 2 gigs or something to do some more cool stuff. So anyways, guys, that's it for the video. Now, maybe you could tell from this one compared to the Switch 2 one that, I don't know, I'm not really as excited or hopeful for a PS5 Pro or anything like that. Although I don't even own a PS5 yet, so the Pro might actually be the first time I even pick one up. I feel like a PS5 Pro would actually be kind of safe, a little bit counterintuitive to like the base console, whereas I feel like with the base console, you should take more risks just because you're defining a whole generation of games, whereas with the Pro console, you generally just kind of like want to make sure stuff doesn't break. But anyways, that's it. Like, comment, subscribe if you like this video, and have a good day.